Dr. Scott, you say in your book, America Fool, that antidepressants are simply not effective. So how do they get FDA approval?
Again, remember that they are effective in one sense.
Okay.
They're not more effective than a sugar pill that's active, has an active ingredient in it, but they did get approval. And understanding that process, I think, is important for any American, because nearly every American takes drugs.
Yeah.
You know, we really probably ought to go back to thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug taken for morning sickness.
That's right.
Yeah. And was a drug that led to very, very serious birth defects. We're talking babies being born without arms or without legs or without both, and deformed organs, and on blindness, and you just name it. Serious, serious birth defects. And of course, that became a world famous event. Life magazine published the pictures. People all over the world knew about it. What a lot of people don't know is that thalidomide was never approved in our country.
It was never approved.
Not in our country. The FDA did not approve the drug. We did not allow it ever to enter our country. Americans were not impacted by that drug. People around the world were, but not in America. And that's because FDA was doing its job well. And really, I think historically, FDA did do its job well. I think the biggest change came following AIDS developing. With the advent of AIDS, we had a lot of protests in Washington, D.C. At one point, we had people with AIDS chaining themselves to the doors of the FDA, chanting, FDA, how many people have you killed today? And it led to changes in thinking. We had always been very slow to approve drugs in America.
That's true.
Very cautious. And the thought was, in other countries, you can get new drugs. You can get them faster than you can in America. That had been the history. The end result of some of those protests, congressmen decided to start introducing bills, and they introduced a bill related to what we call PDUFA, the Prescription Drug User Fee Act of 1992. And that act basically says, from now on, we're going to let the drug makers, the pharmaceutical companies, actually pay to get their drug approved by the FDA. And so whereas there had always been a very adversarial relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the FDA, that changed overnight. All of a sudden, these became friends with one another. And the FDA all of a sudden began to develop relationships that had never been there before. All kinds of people on FDA panels were allowed to take huge honoraria gifts. Come see our factory. We want you to see it. We'll pay you $20,000. Come see our factory. All of a sudden, the FDA panel that would approve these drugs were receiving large amounts of money from industry. In fact, when Vioxx was taken off the market, you might remember that, it led to a large number of heart attacks. A lot of people said, you know, we're being too strict. If they recognized what that research found, when you actually gave Vioxx at prescription levels, the number of heart attacks was incredible. And so it was removed. But then we had an FDA panel voted 15-17 to let it back on the market. That was their decision back in February 2005, again, a long time ago now. But when you analyzed those votes, it was fascinating. Every single person voting to allow that drug back on the market had ties to the pharmaceutical industry. Now, these are FDA panels. And so the point is, we need to change the laws so that if you're receiving $100,000 a year or $10,000 a year from the industry you're supposed to be regulating, you shouldn't be allowed to vote on whether or not that drug goes back on the market. Study after study has found that financial interest does impact our judgment. And so we ought to bring an end to that. Now, how did these drugs get approved? That's how it got approved. Got approved by one vote. Once that was for Prozac. Once that was on the market, all the other drugs. How are you going to say no to?
Oh, they voted on Prozac.
Yeah. Once you've approved one in this class, these are SSRI drugs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Once you've approved one drug within that classification of drugs, how do you say no to all the other drug manufacturers who make a similar drug? And of course, they're all essentially the same drug. The differences will be in half-lives and so forth, but essentially they're all the identical drugs. And so they all came on the market, all came with heavy advertising because of our change in direct-to-consumer advertising. We allowed direct-to-consumer advertising in this country, and sales just skyrocketed. It became an incredible source of income.